Lisa shared with us a little bit about labels. She was first a hard rocker, which I find hard to believe, and then she became a preppy. And one of my favorite tools as a young school kid was this labeler. And I actually still use this thing. And speaking of sharing, which is what you do in grade school, we have prepared speeches, sort of like sharing. Our first speaker spent 10 years in the ashram of the Self-Realization Fellowship, and he recently celebrated 5 years of having post-monastic life. So today he's going to share with us a little bit about that experience. He's speaking from the Advanced Manual Storytelling, which is speech number 2, Let's Get Personal. The Eye of Wisdom, Christian Minson. Christian Minson, The Eye of Wisdom.
The eye of wisdom, or more commonly referred to as the spiritual eye, that point between the eyebrows that is of utmost importance to focus on in many spiritual and meditative practices because it's considered the seat of divine illumination and infinite wisdom. In my 10 years as a monastic, there's one experience that stands out above all others, where the spiritual eye played a very important role in me learning an even more important lesson, though perhaps not in the conventional way that you might expect. The day started out conventionally enough, as the 75 monks of the order came down to our common courtyard area to practice our daily routine of meditation and energization exercises, which is basically just a spiritualized calisthenics routine. Now, the younger monks typically led these exercises because we were learning how to do it right so that we could one day, like the older monks, lead this in our temples and for our general population. I was one of those younger monks, and today was my day to lead. Now, another important fact of the meditations is we had to have a closing prayer. Okay, so we typically took these closing prayers from our studies that we did every day as monks, and there was one that I had been studying for weeks. It came from one of our foremost pioneering disciples, Sister Gyanamata, or Mother of Wisdom, as her name implied. I like to call her the saint of the hard, cold light of day. For her no-nonsense and basically get-to-it approach to the spiritual life. That prayer was, change no circumstance in my life, Lord, change me. So I had that prayer. I studied that prayer for weeks. I would write it out and then write every thought that I had, and then I'd contemplate on it more and write some more, and then I'd take from all the different studies that I did and try to compile an overall general understanding of this prayer, this concept, that I felt I had a pretty good handle on. So now, I was there to lead the energization exercises. And like I said, the spiritual eye was an important part of our practices. We're supposed to focus on that in the exercises and in our meditations. However, the leaders never emphasized that. They just basically would call the next exercise and then the next one, the next one. And it's very easy for your gaze to drift away from that spiritual eye. And so I thought, being a young monk and being full of energy and wanting to change the world for the better, that I was going to give these monks something more. I was going to remind them to keep that gaze at the spiritual eye. And so I did. In the beginning, I said, let's all pray together, keep the gaze at the spiritual eye. And as I went through the exercises, I would give a periodic reminder, if your gaze has wandered, remember, bring it back to the spiritual eye. Have you remembered to keep your gaze at the spiritual eye? Remember the spiritual eye. And every time I would do this, I would notice a growing agitation from one of the more senior and very conservative monks that was practicing about 10 feet away from me. And finally, after about the fourth or fifth reminder that I gave, he lost his cool and just blurted out to the whole courtyard, Ah, come on. Dead silence. A very long and uncomfortable silence. There was nervous giggling from across the courtyard. Nobody knew what to do. And I was just standing there riveted to the ground because I felt this wave of rage coming up from the bottom of my feet all the way into my heart, through my fists that were going to go over there and deck that guy. Fortunately, I was riveted to the ground. It took every bit of strength and a lot of deep breathing for me to regain my composure, to finish those exercises, and then get into the meditation to start leading that. And my meditation was basically on my anger. How could he do this to me? I didn't deserve this. There was no way that this should have happened to me. He had no right. I was just trying to be helpful. That dirty son of a... I opened my eyes, looked at my watch. Oh, it's time for the end of meditation. Time for me to recall the prayer. At which point, coming from my memory banks, I realized a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. I was being divinely set up. Change no circumstance in my life, Lord, change me. How could I say this prayer right now? Everything about my circumstance was wrong. This guy shouldn't have done this to me, and if I said this now, I'd be a complete hypocrite. And yet, if I didn't say this prayer now, with all the studying I'd done on it and all the feelings that I had, this concept under my belt, I would be even more of a hypocrite. And so it was in that instant, that moment, where I had to make that flash decision to give up those feelings of anger and say with as much sincerity as I could possibly muster out loud to all the monks, change no circumstance in my life, Lord. Change me. In that moment, it was like an atomic bomb went off inside me and fused the meaning of those words to the very core of my being in a way that I'd never quite got before. And the next moment, it was like a shockwave returning to me as all the monks repeated those words back. And I realized that I had 75 witnesses to my tribulation and my ultimate transformation and triumph. So that day, I walked out of that chapel with my head held high. That day, I learned more about the nature of the spiritual life in 1 hour than I had in all my years of preparation and study. That day, I became illuminated, albeit indirectly, by the spiritual eye. Now, the story doesn't end there, because that old conservative monk, he must have been touched on some level by the happenings of that day, because he came out later on and sought me out, and in his uncomfortable conservative way, he mumbled and stumbled through an apology for his actions that day, which I graciously accepted. And as he turned to leave, I said, "I'd just like to ask you one question, may I?" He turned around and said, "Yeah, what is it?" And I said, "I was just wondering, was your gaze at the spiritual eye?"